Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us in the first of our new webinar series. So today we will be discussing unconscious bias in the workplace. So I am Jackie Chester, account manager, and today I'm joined by Heather Jones, client development consultant. Hello. And Steve Cavello, psychology data analyst.
Hi all. So why unconscious bias? So firstly, I'd like to talk about diversity. I've pulled a few pieces of research that we discussed in a recent white paper that you can find on our website. So diverse companies have been shown to be more successful. Diverse senior management teams have been found to be more innovative, and diverse teams have been shown to make better decisions. Unconscious bias threatens to hinder efforts to build diverse workforces.
Yeah, exactly. So in reducing unconscious bias, we can create a much more even playing field where people, no matter who they are, have the opportunity to be the best they can be.
So we're going to start with a poll. This comes from a piece of research looking at first impressions. So how long on average do you think it takes us to make a judgment about a person's trustworthiness, competence, likability, or aggressiveness? So you can respond on screen now.
So the options you have are 0.1 seconds, 2 seconds, 30 seconds, or 5 minutes.
I'm really interested to see what people select. We're going to have live results coming through soon. Okay.
All right.
Okay. So most people went for 2 seconds. A lot of people as well picking 30 seconds. That's actually really interesting. The least popular option was 0.1 of a second, and that's actually the correct answer. We actually make decisions about people that quickly in about 0.1 of a second. The study found that the decisions that we make after 0.1 of a second were extremely highly correlated with those made without time pressures. So basically, we're making decisions on people very, very quickly. So what did you both think when you saw this?
I think when I saw the answer 0.1 seconds, I was quite surprised. The reason being that in this day and age, given the amount of emphasis we place on not judging people on first impressions, we might have expected a little bit more consideration.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised. I think everybody knows we do make quick judgments, but not that quick. So it's really surprising to see that kind of in a kind of study.
If anybody has any opinions on the results that have come through, or on the fact that it is such a quick amount of time, please pop them in the question box, and we'll have a look at those at the end. Also, if anybody does have any other questions throughout the webinar, just pop them in and we'll try and address as many as possible.
So the reason I picked this study was to highlight that we often make decisions very quickly and unconsciously. Societal stereotypes deeply grounded in our language and culture influence these decisions and are ultimately our behaviour. And it can be very difficult to change these.
Yeah, so I think the theme of this presentation really is how can we reduce inherent bias. So today we're going to look at some common challenges that are present in the workplace and how the use of people assessments can help overcome biases inherent in all of us. We're going to talk, we thought it would be most useful to talk in 3 streams. The first being recruitment, second promotion and success, and third appraisal and development.
Okay, so the first area is recruitment, and the first challenge we're going to cover is hiring based on erroneous assumptions. So erroneous assumptions in recruitment can be things like somebody thinking they know the culture of a business, or thinking they know what behaviours or personalities they already have within the business, and building teams and cultures based on these incorrect beliefs. A solution to this is considering more factual information as opposed to assumed, really actually knowing the roles you are recruiting for and finding a good fit of candidate.
Absolutely. I think job profiling is very important as well. We worked on a project for a manufacturing company recruiting for an account director role. Assumptions were made on the role what it entailed, and the kind of people that would fit. But going into the business, getting a job profile from multiple stakeholders, so that was people who were already in the role, managers, people they work with day to day, we found that the role was actually a lot more varied than people thought, and the behavioural fit was much less rigid. Adding in data from multiple sources like this reduces the possibility of unconscious bias creeping in from bad assumptions.
Great. So the next challenge is hiring clones of current success. So a manager's natural response to a star or perfect employee can often be to look for the exact same skills and behaviours and try to replicate this person entirely. However, the danger when we do this is that we do not hire a diverse workforce, and gaps can begin to show. We can have blind spots in teams or within the organisation as a whole.
Absolutely, and I think I can think of an example with a nationwide recruitment company that we work with, who frequently use our behavioural profiling assessment, the personal profile analysis. They use this to recruit their internal staff and have been, as I say, for quite a while. Recently, they felt that they began only recruiting, or it transpired that they were only recruiting types of profile that were currently the most successful, i.e. that made the most money. And whilst this seemed useful in the beginning, they soon realised that they were missing out on other skill sets and behavioural preferences that were vital and actually really necessary for the team to function at its optimal level. Things like skills in administration, organisation, and behavioural preferences leaning towards the more supportive, nurturing tendencies. So we did some work with them in this department especially, and actually it transpired that the manager was himself particularly high dominant and very results driven, and therefore only saw the value in these types of people. The manager's unconscious bias we found towards this specific type of person actually had quite a detrimental effect on the rest of the team and the wider business. So the realization of once having his assessments and that information in front of him almost held up a mirror and gave him that kind of self-awareness that he generally needed a lot of variety in his team for better engagement, for better team sort of team rapport, team trust, accountability, that sort of thing, if they were able to rely on each other and not working kind of separately. And they found that it was much more successful once they hired slightly different profiles.
So again, that's really interesting. That supports the case for diversity within teams and within organisations. I often see clients who talk about a few superstars in their team who are really successful, and they try to replicate this success with new hires. So it'll be particular behavioural profiles that they'll look for, and they'll think this is what fits, this is what works, and this is what we'll hire. What I usually recommend in these instances is to conduct a full statistical benchmark that will look at maybe 100 people in their organisation or a large group of people, to look at how psychometric data from assessments predicts objective measures of success, such as sales figures or attrition or any other performance measure. And this way we can see what really works, what good looks like for that organisation. And we can add objectivity into the hiring processes, which in itself can help to reduce inherent biases.
Yeah, and I think also another option to add to that would be to include an extra dimension to the recruitment decisions. And a way we can do this is to look deeper than behaviour and into things like emotional intelligence, which is a really hot topic at the moment. If you're just focusing on behaviour, we kind of view that as more scratching the surface, whereas this kind of deep dive into looking at someone's emotional responses to things can actually give us insight into how to motivate a person, how likely they are to take risks as well in critical situations, and also their top triggers for stress as well. And understanding all these things about a person will increase self-awareness and appreciation for personal differences as well.
Yeah, so we call this incremental validity, and this is basically layering assessments or adding more information to give somebody a more comprehensive and objective overview of a candidate, which in turn increases confidence in the decisions you make, so you don't hire clones or be led by bias. Okay, so unskilled hiring managers. So this challenge often comes about when people are prematurely promoted based on their skill set in their non-managerial role. For example, really great salespeople or accountants, and not on their potential to be a successful manager. A lack of proper onboarding or training for these individuals can also be a contributing factor. These unskilled managers risk employing people based solely on their likability factor or how well they perform at interview, which increases subjectivity and the likelihood of biases.
I think the risk as well that we can minimise that risk through standardising the hiring process. And a recommendation we often make is to create something we call a competency-based framework that will form the basis of your hiring decisions. So what we mean by that is assessing people on your company's desirable behaviours and skills, and that will allow managers to make more robust and informed decisions, and also provides, as I say, a sort of foundation that will underpin the recruitment process. What's great about having this kind of set of values or statements that actually really link well with your company culture, you can generate alongside that interview questions that link back to each standalone competency. And what that can do is that can introduce a really streamlined and efficient process that not only takes the pressure off of hiring managers, especially new managers that may have not been experienced previously in interview processes, but not only that, it allows every candidate to experience the same process and ultimately receive fair treatment.
Yeah, and it's also not just about who's the best fit for the role, but it's also thinking about the wider team, the culture, the business as a whole, and how well they gel into that. Otherwise, we can end up with the proverbial fox in a henhouse scenario where someone can upset the balance and engagement of a team.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if the manager has an understanding of the behavioural and emotional tendencies of a candidate and how they'll align with that culture, this will give insight into how they'll perform, not just in the job, but how they'll impact the team they work with and the wider organisation as well.
Great. So adverse impact and recruitment promotion bias. So adverse impact is defined as when a process has a discriminatory effect on a protected group, such as recruitment or promotion decisions. There are a number of ways in which this can manifest in the workplace. For example, people hiring in their own image, or people hiring or promoting friends within an organisation, people they get on very well with or have sort of common ground with. For example, we went to the same universities together, we were in the same rugby club.
Absolutely. Adverse impact is such a hot topic now, both in the literature and something that we get asked about so much. We recently completed a longitudinal study investigating a company's recruitment processes, tracking people's demographic groups and their success through the recruitment process, as well as their behavioural preferences using the Thomas Personal Profile analysis. So this allowed the organisation to get an objective evaluation into any potential adverse impact, but also see how the psychometric assessment was adding objectivity into their decision making. The personal profile analysis was not only shown to be predictive of ultimate success in getting hired, so works as a psychometric tool in that sense, was also shown not to bias any group. So every demographic group that we looked at had an equal chance of getting any particular profile. So it's a really useful addition to their processes. Adverse impact can potentially impact promotion as well as recruitment processes. One important way to reduce adverse impact in promotion decisions is to define processes in advance and to make these processes known to staff. So there's transparency there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I've got an example here that we work with a large manufacturing company, and we actually help them to build internal assessment centres that provide a really structured and proactive approach to identify high potential individuals. And they help to identify them at a much earlier stage as well. So in some normal scenarios, 5 years down the line, we have a vacancy. At that point in time, you generally tend to select who's going to fill it, who's doing really well and at the moment. But actually, a process like this provides foresight and clarity for the individuals and for the people hiring as well. The individuals can have the opportunity to experience, again, that really structured onboarding, and also they get to establish career pathways right from the outset by discovering what those person's ambitions are, what their behaviours are, what teams they'll fit into, and also kind of mapping out their milestones on the way to their kind of ultimate goal with the company. And again, talking about fair treatment, this is a great way to provide some, again, same experience for everybody, and it stops that bias from creeping in.
Yeah, I guess that also stops the whole he who shouts loudest situation and the different profiles we might have within a business.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about kind of the types of active and passive profiles that manifest as well, and how often active profiles, again, like you say, do shout louder. They do tend to kind of be heard more than perhaps the passive profiles that tend to be more kind of thoughtful and you know, less kind of assertive in certain situations. So it actually gives fair opportunities for all to be heard, all to be assessed at the same level.
Yeah, I guess less forceful as well, sort of pushing themselves forward less. Great. So tenure over competence. So we find this a lot where candidates are promoted on the basis of how long they've been with an organisation, as opposed to objectively measuring somebody's ability to be a good manager or leader. As we've discussed previously, the skill set needed to do a job are very different than to manage a team or a function. And by doing this, a business can really miss out on great people who have natural leadership skills, who can really drive change and effectiveness within an organisation.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I tend to see this all the time. The repercussions can be really detrimental, actually. I think one intervention we took to avoid this outcome is to use the robust competency-based assessment and interview process. And again, that's based on objective sources of information. Not only will this improve quality of those promoted, but also reduce the likelihood of bias, again, creeping into your processes as well.
So the next topic we wanted to talk about was work-life balance and life demands, which can be very different for different groups of people. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work for everyone. What are your thoughts on issues that have been in the press recently around maternity and paternity pay?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big topic at the moment, and there really needs to be complete parity of maternity and paternity pay. Because unconscious bias towards women can't really be eliminated until the prospect of hiring women and men is equal.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. I think it's really important to have flexible work practices that take into account people's lives outside of work. I think assessments, again, provide that objective measure that prevent potential unfair treatment and promote based on goodness of fit. I think this has so much relevance when considering mothers returning to work and potential challenges that they face. If they were provided with a kind of a structured assessment process, it would be more likely that they would have, you know, generally more success or more perceived success.
Absolutely. So you're again making decisions based on an evidence approach rather than just looking at potentially unconsciously biasing people.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the final stream is looking at appraisals and development. So subjectivity of appraisals. We know that with appraisals, that subjective single source feedback from your manager is rarely comprehensive enough to be regarded as good quality. And we find it's quite often down to the personal relationship you have with your line manager and various different sources of unconscious bias. A way to minimise this is to introduce an objective appraisal process that encourages and empowers employees to offer advice and feedback to their peers. And a great way of doing this is through something like a 360. I think it's fair to say that your colleagues see you at work a lot more than your manager does, therefore are more likely to give realistic and well-rounded feedback, resulting in more accurate and impartial appraisals. Now, this inspires fair treatment for all and provides the person taking the 360 with a deeper understanding of where they need to improve. So lack of manager focus. Managers are often very busy. We know this, and they may be more inclined to support those they have a closer personal relationship with and are possibly more similar to themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and as well, another thing to add that I think perhaps a lot of people listening as well that have had various managers and various kind of development discussions or end of year reviews, they can be quite uncomfortable depending on the manager, and they can sometimes seem forced or a little bit tick box. And it can actually take the relaxed, informal approach out of what should be quite an organic, positive, fruitful discussion. So what we would suggest really is by giving the manager more information on themselves, and by promoting that kind of self-awareness with them as a starting point, can actually help them refine their managing techniques by, again, knowing more about themselves and what makes them tick. In turn, I think then giving information by use of assessments on their team can allow them then to understand how best to support each individual and develop a style that suits each person as well. If you can imagine a scenario with a manager who, again, really knows their team quite instinctively, has built up a real kind of affinity and understanding how, you know, what people's stresses are, how far they can push them, that sort of thing in a proactive, healthy way, versus a manager who misses the mark on this and doesn't understand and appreciate differences. I think there's a massive kind of gap in successes as a manager between those two kind of points there. Yeah.
Okay, so one last research study from me. I picked this study. It was a really large study investigating gender bias at a university. What they did is they used a workshop that was aimed at changing habits around gender bias, and they found this workshop was only a short workshop. It was about 3 hours, but it was really successful at reducing gender bias in the workplace, which was great. And those improvements were seen quite a while after the actual intervention itself. However, when looking at implicit gender bias, so this is people making the kinds of quick decisions we talked about in the example at the start, when people were making decisions in 0.1 of a second, gender bias was still there. The reason I picked this study is because it suggests to me that while we can work to reduce bias, eliminating it is a much more difficult task.
Absolutely, I agree. I think we've talked a lot today about how quickly and easily unconscious bias can creep in and affect our decision making. And I think to note, what I'd like to stress really is that assessments are by no means a quick fix. Whilst we talk about them being really successful and you know, having lots of kind of good case studies and stories about how they work, they're not something you can quickly employ in a business and it work all of a sudden. Whilst in saying that, they are a good place to start, as they do bring objectivity and factual information to otherwise subjective processes. But I think what's just as important are people's awareness and attitude towards them, and how consistency and momentum is really absolutely key in their successful application. It is human nature to have a desire to repeat something we have a positive experience with. So introducing assessments in the right way is really very important if you want to deploy something like this in your business and have success.
Great. So that is the end of the presentation. What we've got now is a few questions that are popping through. So we'll try and cover off some of these in the next 10 minutes or so. So I've got one here, which is...
There's an interesting one that I've picked out that's a challenging one, but it is one for me. I am a sucker for punishment. So I'll read the question out. If there are certain profiles that are better for some roles, don't we end up having the problem of a lack of diversity again within teams? So this is when I was talking about statistical benchmarks before, where we would look at what works for an organization, what traits are important in an organization. Absolutely, it's something we're conscious of when we make recommendations. So what we tend to find is, if we look at different performance measures, different traits are good at different things. So it's not just a case of you need to fill your business with people who are exactly like this, because different people within that will bring different things. So I think you will find certain things that are very predictive. So if there's a particular preference for very influential, persuasive people, hire people like that. Within the rest of the team, you will still want diversity, because you still have diversity amongst other tasks that weren't part of the particular performance measures that we use for the benchmark. So it's something we are very cognizant of when we are doing benchmarks, to make those kind of recommendations.
Yeah, so another couple of things that are popping through are, so have you ever explored potential biases in practitioner interpretations when feeding back or evaluating people with different characteristics? So it's important to say here that we have standardized training for all of our different psychometrics. Therefore, people are taught to interpret results and feedback in the same way, which should take off any bias out of the way that people deliver this. Also, if these are being used for any sort of development conversation, using an objective measure is always going to be better than a purely subjective conversation. So yeah, they would be generally our recommendations. It's really important from a best practice perspective for us to have these training courses, and everything we do is registered with the British Psychological Society, so we really have our rigour in place. So I think another one for you here, Steve. Somebody here curious about the validity and reliability for translated tests.
So we offer our assessments in, I think, 56 different languages, perhaps more.
I think maybe more.
We recently did Telugu. I think it might be more than that now. So we always try and we always ask people to take our assessments in their first language where possible. Translating an assessment isn't just a simple case of someone translating it and off we go. The process we follow is a very robust translation process with a preferred translation company who we get them to translate it, someone who's aware of psychometrics, a partner we've worked with many times. They also translate back into English blind, and we review that from a psychological point of view to ensure that the meaning of the original is still retained. What we then do is we run statistical pilots. We get 100 people or more to take the assessment in that target language to make sure the statistical properties of the original are still retained in the translation. That way we know our translations are very robust.
Well, so another question. So what do you recommend to get the most out of 360?
Well, I'll take this one. It's my hot topic at the moment, I think. To get the most out of 360, I think to start with, I think the most important thing is positioning. I think I mentioned it a moment ago around all assessments. It's important to position them in the right way. But I think especially with 360, because there's a lot of people involved. And if it's positioned in the wrong way, I think it can be detrimental and you won't get the right amount of feedback or data that you need to actually kind of, give you any good kind of insight. So I think kind of addressing things early, talking about the process early, what it's going to involve, lots of communication, both kind of verbal announcements, written announcements, just so everybody is well aware of what the process is going to be. Next, I think is having really relevant competencies that actually everybody can align with, everybody can kind of be rated against. So having a really robust competency framework, as I mentioned earlier, is key as well. And also, I think to allow people to or either select respondents for people or allow people to select their own respondents. If you're running a 360 as almost kind of for the first time, depending on your culture, it's up to you whether or not you would choose to have people select their own or choose kind of for them. But I think that the key is the good quality respondents. So people that see them in the role can comment on their desirable behaviours and kind of abilities, rather than people that haven't worked with them for a while or don't kind of see them very often. It sounds obvious, but actually we do see it quite a lot when people say, oh, I probably shouldn't have picked that person because they've not been able to observe me and they've not given me a good rating, or they've not given me a rating that's relevant, so they've chosen to not observe, which is kind of like a no comment in the questionnaire. So we often say, yeah, good quality respondents are really key for getting the most out of 360 as well. And to round that off, feedback as well. Everybody should get feedback for 360. It's not something that should be done and then put in a drawer, like with all assessments, momentum, keeping the buzz alive about it. I really think feedback and getting quality feedback to these people with development plans as well. Again, making it kind of stretch out throughout their development, throughout the year perhaps, and keep coming back to it and talking about those discussions and that feedback and redoing the 360 as well, so then people can compare their metrics and how they've improved. I think that's ultimately where you're going to see the value in it.
And that's how you get more buy-in from the...
Absolutely, yeah. Well. If you do it once and put it in a drawer, it won't make any difference to the person. You've got to keep it alive, and I think that's what's key.
And it's the whole return on investment piece for any development work you do throughout the year.
Not just for the person, it's for the company as well.
Exactly.
So making sure you can see the money that you put in, what you're getting out of it. So absolutely.
Great. And I think we've just got time for one more. So I think this is one for you, for Steve as well. Have the Thomas tools been designed and are the algorithms reflective of diverse populations?
Probably one for me. Yes, absolutely. So when you're taking a normative assessment, you are compared to a norm group. This is where you won't get a score that is just you got X out of 10 or something like that. You will get, this is how you compare to other people who have taken the assessment. And building those reference groups, those norm groups as we call them, is quite an involved process. What we first look to do is in that particular country, in that particular region, or in that particular field, we will look to see what is a representative sample of that working population. We will look at ethnicity, gender, industry, age, a whole range of different demographic and work-related questions. And we'll then build a sample based on assessments taken that fits that. That way we can show we have represented everyone involved in that working population, and so we can have confidence that this speaks for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for tuning in today and for listening. If there are any questions that we haven't been able to answer today, we will. We have your email addresses. We will come back to you with some further information in the next few days. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, all.